We now look again at the convictions of 8 mafia figures today by a federal court in New York. Do this and other recent successes mean that law enforcement agencies are now really making progress against organized crime? We'll be discussing that with one of the prosecutors leading the battle and with an author who knows the mafia. But first, some background on today's case. The trial lasted for 10 weeks, and it took the jury 5 days to reach a verdict that filled 24 pages. The jury found that all 8 defendants were guilty of participating in a commission, which has acted as a board of directors for the mafia ever since the 1930s. Prosecutors charged that the commission met periodically to settle territorial disputes, divide money, and authorize high-level mob murders. The jury found that the commission members had used extortion to control New York City's construction industry, dictating which cement companies would be allowed to bid on contracts over $2 million. The commission got a 2% kickback. The companies got a guarantee of no labor problems. The jurors also found that the commission authorized the murder of crime boss Carmine Galante at a Brooklyn restaurant in 1979. The defendants were convicted under a federal law known as the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act, or RICO. The law allows attorneys to prosecute individuals not just for specific criminal acts, but for ongoing participation in a criminal organization. Justice Department officials called today's verdict the most powerful blow ever directed at the mafia's symbol of power.
With the deposing of the heads of the families as we know them, I think that a power vacuum will be created within the superstructure, within the structure of La Cosa Nostra, that as with any centralized organization, and I would say that a criminal enterprise needs centralization even more so than a legitimate enterprise because of the need to control greed. I think that there will be a tremendous amount of turmoil. There will be a power struggle that will ensue, people vying for these top slots. And I think that it should give us, in law enforcement, an upper hand to take advantage of the turmoil, of the disorganization, of what the present members see as a disintegration of their structure, their discipline, the code of silence, and all the other characteristics associated with La Cosa Nostra.
Do these successful prosecutions mean that law enforcement agencies are gaining on the mafia? To discuss that, we have Ronald Goldstock of the Organized Crime Task Force, who helped produce today's convictions. Also with us is Talese, author of a best-selling book on organized crime. They're calling this one of the biggest, if not the biggest, blows ever against organized crime. Does this mean that the mafia are being beaten?
I think this particular conviction speeds up the process of them being beaten. What is happening is there are sociological changes within the mob. New generations are taking over. They don't have the values of their elders. Internal discipline is weakening. There are a larger number of informants. Electronic surveillance is more possible. And that's occurring over time.
You mean to say even if you guys left them alone, they would be running out of steam?
I think that inevitably they would, although I think that would be a mistake. They could last a lot longer and do a lot more damage during the intervening period of time. I do think, though, that these convictions speed up the process enormously in the long run. In the short run, it makes them much more difficult for them to operate.
The pattern in the past has always seemed to be that no matter what convictions law enforcement was able to get, the mafia, to use the sort of common name for these families, the mafia always seemed to be able to grow another branch or another arm or throw up new figures and replace anybody who was like new soldiers in the battle. Why can't they continue to do that?
Well, first about the name Mafia, I use that to refer to the group in Sicily and the group in the United States, Cosa Nostra, which is different than the group in Sicily. It's not a transplanted unit over into the United States. This is uniquely American. The second thing is that before we were fighting a war of attrition. We were taking off one person at a single time, occasionally putting them in jail for a short period of time. The RICO statute allows us to take large numbers of people, the hierarchy of a family, an entire crew within a Cosa Nostra family, and put them in prison, and that disrupts activity. Furthermore...
Would you stop there for a minute and define the RICO statute for us and say what difference it makes to you law enforcement people?
The RICO statute stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was passed in 1970. Was so advanced that really prosecutors only learned how to use it in the last 5 or 6 years. And what it does is to allow law enforcement to go after large numbers of people, syndicates, rather than individuals. It also allows the use of civil remedies and other kinds of remedial action in the organized crime area. That's made a major difference.
You said a moment ago that the structure of the crime families was changing. There were sociological changes. Describe those a little more.
Sure. When the mob was first formed in the United States around 1930, those who formed it were first-generation Americans who were born in Sicily or Italy. They had old-world values, those of honor and respect and kinship. They grew together, and the ties that bound them together were those values. As the generations passed, the new generations that are coming in, the second and third generations, are more motivated by power and wealth. And what ties them together now are those values. And those are more likely to be broken when pressure is put upon them. And so we see the mob changing and allowing them to cooperate with law enforcement for the first time. It took an insider in the mob 30 years, the first time, Joe Valachi, who spoke in 1960, and no one else for 10 years after that. And now we find them coming out month after month, people from within the mob, top bosses, lower-level figures, testifying, writing books.
Gay, Talese, you're an expert, at least from the outside, on the codes of honor and so on in the Mafia. Your book, Honor Thy Father, suggests that. Are there these deep sociological, generational changes happening? And are they having the effect that Mr. Goldstock says?
There are certainly changes, because the Mafia that was transported to the New World with immigration, which really began in 1880 in a large way from southern Italy, not in 1930, did bring with it mostly an agrarian culture into an industrial society, be it Chicago, New York, or wherever we're talking. Today we have the third generation from, or fourth generation from, that early immigration, and you have still unpronounceable names, some of them convicted today. But I do suggest the larger question, is this going to be the end of the Mafia? I suggest it is not any more than it was in 1957 when I was a young reporter at the New York Times and we covered the great rounding up of all the kings of the United States' Mafia establishment. And we were told at that time it would be the end of the Mafia. I've heard this too many times, and I'm not tonight, while impressed with the achievements of the law enforcement officials and their success with the new technology, I'm never unimpressed with the skill with which human nature can adjust to the new technology. And I don't think there's going to be an end to the Mafia tonight, as long as there is a need for the products with which the Mafia trades and makes profit. As long as that market is there, as long as there are enough, in the sense of the American lawless population, wishing what the Mafia provides or any other lawless group provides, there's going to be a market, and there's always going to be those to be the middlemen, call them Mafia or whatever. Let's
come back to that larger question in a moment. But on the specific point of Mr. Goldstock's point, that there are these sociological changes, I mean, it was always a matter of faith in the Mafia that nobody squealed. It took, Joe Valachi was the first, it took 30 years, you said, and then 10 years after that. He says the motives now are money and power, and that suggesting that this blood code of honor is no longer the operating glue that it was.
I think it's a rather romantic notion to think that these men who came over here were looking for honor. They were looking for wealth. We're talking about the latter part of the 19th century as well as the early part of the 20th century. See, the people who were in the Mafia really represented the most avaricious of the immigrant group, unwilling to work as lawfully as barbers and shoe shine people. All the people who came to this country, whether they're Irish or Italian or Jewish or whatever they are, by and large started at the bottom, doing rather menial tasks and being rather humbled by the experience in America and willing not to be rich in one generation. The Mafia really were, as I think I said before, a rather avaricious group who wanted to get it in one generation. And so this greed that is characteristic of the element that became notorious.
That's not new.
It's not new, and you're always going to find that in this young group.
You're saying fundamentally they're not changing.
I'm saying fundamentally, while there are technological changes, they can wiretap and they will find.
No, but the Mafia, the ties within the Mafia itself and their motivations
that I don't think
are
are
not
going to be changed by any group in law enforcement. That is, the market. The American market for lawless transactions, be it drugs or wire, whatever it is we're talking about, whatever it is. Secondly, there's always going to be, in the new immigrant group from whatever country, now we're talking about Sicily and southern Italy primarily when you're talking about Mafia, there are always going to be those middlemen who want to capitalize on the market. So unless you eliminate the market, you're certainly not going to eliminate the marketeers, which is what the mafia happens to be.
How do you view all this?
Well, I think what I suggested before is right, that there are changes. I'm not suggesting that the mob is going to be completed tonight, it's over. Nor do I think it has an effect necessarily on the underlying criminal activities, of which Gay is right. There is a market for them, and there will be somebody providing those goods and services, and in some cases even providing predatory activities. The difference is that it may not be the Cosa Nostra as we know it today, and I think the difference is that the family will change dramatically in the next 5 to 10 years because they are not tied together the way they were before. I think your explanation of it was accurate.
As you used to have prize fighters with Italian names, you don't have that so much anymore. Yes, you will in the future have the new fighters in the lawless world of organized crime, perhaps with different names. Maybe they won't be ending in vowels, there'll be some other name. But you're still going to have the same structure, or a structure, not the same structure, a structure that is going to cater, as I'm saying perhaps too repetitiously, to the need for whatever it is the product.
Let's take a product that is very much talked about today, and that is drugs. Are other immigrant groups, other ethnic groups, now beginning to erode the dominance of the Italian descended mafia, and are they becoming more powerful?
Well, they're becoming powerful in another way. The mob never had dominance in the narcotics field, at least with respect to cocaine and marijuana. They did for a short time in the importation of heroin. But they are different. They're a different entity, and they're growing around drugs, and they have a single service purpose. Whereas the mob, when it began, and I suggested 1930, not because the migration was in 1930, but because of the Castellammarese War and the original organization by Maranzano was in 30.
Prohibition is what was established, that the big market for them was illegal liquor.
That's right,
That's what brought that mafia into such a cohesive force, because the profits were so large.
Except that even during that period of time, the individuals in the mob were involved in a wide variety of criminal activities. And then they merged together because the mob gave them a system which provided opportunities for them to enhance those activities. And that was really the function of the mob. It is conceptually different than drug groups which are not involved in wide activities in a whole variety of the economic sphere, but only in the importation.
Are you confident with the new tools you have, the electronic devices that let you wiretap, for instance, or eavesdrop, as was the case? I mean, and I think your office was provided some of the means. There were conversations that were tapped inside a Jaguar that belonged to one of these family bosses. And presented in evidence. That and the new laws you have as tools. Are you confident that, although you haven't done it tonight, that you can actually, if not eliminate, greatly reduce the activity of the mafia?
Yeah, I think so. And I put the time period within 5 to 10 years. I think that the use of electronic surveillance combined with the RICO statute, combined with the fact that there are informants within the mob, people within the mob willing to wear concealable recorders and tape conversations with their colleagues, makes a major difference, and I think that we will have a tremendous impact on them.
Isn't a case like today's and the other recent successful prosecutions, isn't that going to make younger members of these mafia families or potential recruits think twice about it? Wonder whether the inviolable code that nobody will squeal isn't so often violated now that somebody they deal with may be wearing a listening device. Isn't that going to change things?
There's always going to be, among any element, those who are the overreachers, the most ambitious, the most willing to take risks, which is in the great American tradition. And I suggest that the mafia is very much in the tradition of free enterprise. And there are going to be those who are more driven to succeed and who take the chance to confront the odds and to profit where there's great profits to be made. And as long as these profits are to be made, there are going to be those seeking those profits.
You mean whether it's Ivan Boesky or whether it's...
And whether it's, perhaps I see in the streets of New York, people from Kenya are selling hot watches. And maybe the people from Kenya within a generation will be moving the people named Maranzano and Luciano.
So you are not as confident. You just don't believe that Mr. Goldstock with his new tools can do this.
There was something called Appalachia about 20-some years ago, when all the kings of the underworld were rounded up and put into a couple of years of pretty much solitary confinement. And here we They flourishing with a new group. There'll always be new groups as long as the market is there.
I don't think we disagree at all. I'm suggesting that's probably true.
But you're just changing characters. The names are changing, but
that's
the
right.
system is the same.
I am not talking about organized crime. I am talking about the Cosa Nostra, and I think that this has dealt a major blow to the Cosa Nostra because the changes are.
Well, then you're talking about the Italian assimilation into the American system. Then you have
that's all part
so the
of it.
Italians can become sufficiently successful in legitimate business that they have no need to be illegitimate.
No, I don't think that's true. I think that the Italians are amazingly successful in legitimate business.
Yes,
at the
they are.
present time.
But we don't have not coincidentally all these Italian names in your
But that's Cosa Nostra. It's limited
to
to Italians. There is certainly Hispanic organized crime and Asian organized crime,
but not as famous
and Jewish organized crime.
as you seem to make them. They're not as pursued, or let's say, so dramatized and publicized as are the Italians.
Wait 5 years, because the Hispanics with the drug trade will be.
Well, the
as
Spanish have been
famous
around a
and
long time now. They've been around a long time.
That's right, and drugs are now coming into their own.
Okay, thank you both, gentlemen. Two views. Mr. Talese, Mr. Goldstock, thank you both.
Thank you.